Hey y'all, it's Zach here from World of Game Design with another entry in our How to Play series. Been a while. Good to see ya. Glad to be back. This is the first time we've revisited a game and we're doing a new edition tutorial. I won't be going in alone though. As some of you know at this point, World of Game Design has acquired the Zweihander game, and this new edition will be published by our company. To that end, we didn't just acquire the game and the IP, we also brought on board the game's original creator, Daniel Fox. Say hey, Daniel.
Hey everybody, my name is Daniel, and I'm the creator and project lead for Zweihander Reforged.
Daniel is going to be helping me with this video, and we're going to walk through exactly how to play this Reforged edition of the game. If you know how to play an older edition of the game, you've already known a chunk of this, but we'll also cover what's different as we move through the video. If at any point this tickles your fancy, you can head over to the show notes and get your own copy of the game. We'd absolutely love that. Okay, let's get into it. Daniel, why don't you start us off with the themes?
From a narrative perspective, Reforged will feel familiar in some ways. You're still experiencing a dark fantasy world with aspects of gothic horror and deep brutality. We're still asking you to make tough moral choices in the game and to tell the types of stories that oftentimes you don't see in most RPGs with a black and white set of answers. It's still a world where your well-tuned knight in shining armor sitting atop their warhorse can still be surrounded by peasants, and if the rolls don't go their way, you can still be unhorsed and dismembered rather quickly. Although Zweihander Reforged is not quite as brutal as Merkborg, it's not the end of the world after all, but the stakes are intentionally built higher than what you'd find in heroic fantasy games like Dungeons & Dragons. It's low magic, early era gunpowder, lots of sorcery, and a bestiary chocked full of twisted monsters from the ethereal veil, and both beasts and people corrupted by entities from beyond the stars. You'll be warring against your own levels of corruption along the way, as you are not averse to being twisted in kind. The more you fall prey to your worst self, the deeper corruption sinks its claws into you. Should you fall to your worst self, a permanent malignancy will take hold of your form and your appearance will change, looked upon by the townsfolk with the same level of fear and scorn as the monsters you're fighting against. However, it's not all doom and gloom and tragedy in Zweihander. A fire softly kindles in the darkness, and you have a chance to add your flame to it as well. It's your story to tell, after all. The question is, will you be a band of survivors that rises above the filth and the darkness, or will they be seduced by the power and coerced by corruption and fall into their own tragedy?
Looking at the mechanics of the game, Zweihander uses D10s for nearly everything. You'll need 3 of them. And then D6s for the majority of damage rolls. Just like in previous editions of the game, you'll be rolling 2d10, 1 for the tens place and 1 for the single digits, to produce a result from 1 to 100. We call this D100 for simplicity. When you roll a D100, you'll be trying to roll under a target number, just like in Call of Cthulhu. So a roll of 99 is absolutely atrocious, and a roll of 1 is inarguably incredible. You'll know what number you're shooting for by looking at your survivor sheet, with some influence by the GM. As an example, your character sheet may say that you succeed on a ranged attack with a roll of 54 or under. The GM can modify that target number based on additional context, like adjusting you down to a target number of 34 or under because it's a moonless night. Or they could improve your chances up to a 74 because they've determined that the guard is beginning to doze while on the job and you should have an easier time hitting them. Crits are cool too. Basically, anytime you roll double digits, like 22, 33, 44, etc., you have a crit. If it's under your target number, then it's a critical success, and if it's over your target, it's a critical failure. That means bumping your base target for ranged attacks from your 54 to a 56 means that you now crit succeed on 1 additional number, 55, as opposed to crit failing on a 55. When you're rolling damage, you're usually rolling d6s. Damage dealt with spells still does a d10, just like in previous editions of the game, but d6s are standard for weapons. Any 6s you roll on a d6 means you get to re-roll that die and add both the initial value and the second result together. This can keep going as well, so a dice that continually rolls a 6 could result in truly massive amounts of damage. The same goes for rolling d10s for magic. Your base damage might be under a 10, but I've seen crazy results where the total pushed higher than 30. This is a bigger deal than you might think, because health doesn't probably work the way you think it does, but we'll talk more on that later.
Let's take a look at our survivor sheet. There's a lot going on here, but let's start with what is likely to be most familiar to you. Your primary attributes are similar to what you find in D&D. 7 core attributes that are the same as they were in previous editions of Zweihander. Agility, basically dexterity from D&D without affecting your to-hit with ranged weapons. Brawn, which is basically your strength from D&D, but without affecting your to-hit with melee weapons. Combat for all weapon attacks and other fun stuff like black powder weapons. Fellowship, how well your character connects to others in the world. Intelligence, your character's know-how. And willpower, which is kind of like D&D's wisdom, but also heavily influences spellcraft. Unlike D&D, your attribute, like a 12 or a 14 or a 15, doesn't contribute like +2 or +0. Instead, if your attribute is 40%, then that is your attribute you roll. You have a 40% chance to succeed something. Next to these attributes, though, are a number of skills that you can have up to 3 ranks in, and each rank gives you a 10% boost to your roll. In general, you'll have a stat in each primary attribute from around 35 to 60. So if your combat is 50 and you have 2 ranks in the melee skill, you have a total value of 70% to hit. In this case, 70% is then your survivor's target number for any melee skill tests. Pretty easy, right? So then you're going to grab a pair of D100s and roll either a 70 or under to succeed. For those familiar with previous editions of the game, you'll notice that the skill list has changed. It's smaller now, with items like intimidation and warfare being removed and black powder being added. These have been folded into other skills, and if you're converting from first edition to Reforged, simply work with your game master to swap out what they think might be good to use instead by default. We'll provide those conversion guides in the book. That covers this massive section down there. Now let's take a look up at the top. Here we have a condensed life path overview detailing the particulars about your character. Some of them make no difference to the game's mechanics, like your survivor's name, age, and gender, while others factor heavily. Let's focus on just those that offer mechanical adjustments. Your ancestry is the first one. Zweihander is by default humanocentric and cosmopolitan, so you're likely to play human, but there are over a dozen possible ancestries for you to choose from elves to dwarves, to less common concepts like Grendel, Firbolg, Woodwoes, Selkies, Dampiers, and the Awakened. Your ancestry will give you a talent, which is basically a special ability that's unique to your kindred. That also means no 2 elves are the same. Your ancestry isn't a monolith, and each ability highlights cultural differences within your ancestry. The next thing you're going to look at is your upbringing, which could be anything from an academic to someone who grew up in a forsaken household. That's going to give you a one-time bonus, 5%, to one of your attributes, and it's permanent. Plus, I got to give you some starting armor, some additional money, especially if your upbringing was a little bit more wealthy or militaristic. Speaking of which, after that is social class, which will give you some silver pieces to spend on more gear, but sometimes modifies how you interact with other NPCs in the game. Social class does play a factor. Then there's your brush with death, which has both heavy roleplay and mechanical implications. Sometime in your recent past, while you're creating your character, they had a near-death experience. In the wake of this, you became a survivor, and you have developed 2 distinct personality traits called your tragic flaw and your inner strength. By role-playing your tragic flaw and inner strength, you gain reward points, kind of like experience points in D&D, that you can use to spend to unlock new abilities. Why RP, you ask? Well, of course, it stands for role-playing, and yeah, that's kind of intentional. Once you know your brush with death, tragic flaw, and inner strength, you'll determine your first scar. This scar is a detrimental mechanic but narratively important, as your survivor will always carry it with them. They gain this scar from their brush with death. It could be a physical impairment, emotional trauma, or even a deep spiritual wound. We're aiming to have over 100 in the game, so no 2 survivors will have the same brush with death or scar. Finally, there's your profession, arguably the most important choice and similar to the choice of class in D&D. And you'll be making this choice twice again in your adventures. In the core game, there's about 100 professions to check out, and your upbringing determines which professions you get to start with. Everything from a theologian to a fop, to a gutter snipe, to a pit fighter, to a diabolist. Each profession gives you a couple of tools, but more importantly, you get another talent from this, and you'll also get a bunch of things that you can unlock through spending RP points during gameplay, which is pretty cool. Basically, every session you get something to unlock. So what happens when you unlock everything in your profession? Well, now it's time to choose a new class. Maybe you progress from being a fop to a courtier as you played through several adventures around royalty and feel that it's a natural progression. Or perhaps your fop fell on hard times with their band of survivors, and there's a harder edge to them than you would have imagined. They could fall to becoming a footpad or a sellsword. Or perhaps your fop found a forbidden grimoire and wants to walk the path of the Diabolist. A quick note from previous editions of the game. We've removed expert professions, as you can pick all professions during life path creation. The whole list is now right there from the beginning. And with the way that you can move through intermediate and advanced tiers now, you can also custom create your own profession. We think you'll like this option, and it's been one of the favorites, I think, of our playtesters too. That leaves only fight scene related items for the rest of the sheet, so let's move on to the back and save those for later. We're not going to cover everything here, but you're going to see a few handy places to put those scars, tools, and talents we mentioned from your ancestry and profession. I do want to point out the corruption tracker here. It comes from the influence of entities from beyond the stars, a place called the Vault of Night. During the course of your adventures, you may make choices or have choices of others thrust upon you, which result in taking on points of corruption. For each point, mark off a phase of the moon. There are 10 moons there. When the moon is completely dark, or 10 points, your appearance changes as you gain on the malignancy. We talked about these earlier. These give you damnable new powers, but at the cost of gaining more and more corruption. They kind of feed themselves. Remember how we talked about Zweihander World changing you? Malignancies are one of those tools that just does it. Last but not least, let's talk about magic. Magic users are few and far between in the world at large, but players will have options of playing arcane and divine magic casters. You are the exception to the rule after all, you're survivors. You can now practice covenant magic, striking bargains with entities from beyond the Vault of Night. To cast a spell, you simply make an occultism test. This differs from previous editions where you made an incantation skill test, but it otherwise works the same. Some spells are easier to cast and are by default simple for spellcasters to succeed on. Others are much more potent and the difficulty is scaled to match. Dealing with magic is always about a cautious dance with the forces of misfortune. Every spell has a bonus effect for crit successes and a dangerous hazard for rolling a critical failure. You don't really have spell slots in this game like D&D, but you'll be weighing the risks of more and more detriments each time you risk playing with these forces. Sometimes it just becomes less of a gamble to draw a dagger.
Most of my fight scene talk is going to be very, very similar from the previous edition, but there are a few areas where there's a massive difference. Here's a few things we can clear out quickly. Movement and ranges are communicated in paces, and there's a lot of things a survivor creature can do on their turn. Initiative is determined by rolling 2d10 and adding your initiative modifier. The higher the result, the faster you go in initiative. Most of all, it's streamlined, and fights that used to last 8 to 10 rounds now end in 4 to 5. It's vastly streamlined from what you've seen in previous editions. The game uses an action point system once you get into a fight scene. At the start of your turn, you'll get 3 action points to use, and it's up to you on how you want to spend them. Basic movement costs a point, as does using a weapon or casting a simple spell. This means you could spend 1 action point to move up on an opponent, then you could swing your sword at them twice with your other 2 action points, or you could cast a spell and then swing your sword. There are a number of stunts you can use to spend your points on, like trying to disarm or blind your opponent, as well as special actions like taunting, binding wounds, and interacting with objects, and other movement actions like doing a maneuver or charging. Not all of these only take 1 action point, however, and determining how you want to spend your points is a decision that changes with each turn. Also, this action list has changed slightly from previous editions. You won't see, for example, take cover as an action anymore, because it's been rolled into the much more wider-reaching maneuver action. Likewise, there's not a called shot action anymore, but there is a street fight attack for using something other than a weapon you're skilled in, and a weaken attack, which is a melee skill test that can deal damage, but also potentially reduces damage thresholds for that enemy. And that's huge. Again, that's the second tease, but we're getting to how damage works here in just a moment. You may even want to hold on to some of your points, as they only recharge at the start of your next turn. And if you spend all of them on your own movement, attacks, and stunts, you won't have any left to make reactions like counterspell or assisting an ally during their turn. A massive change from previous editions is the removal of the parry and dodge reactions. While those were definitely cool, they tend to slow the game down. But there's notes in the book for adding these back in if you really want to. So on your turn, when you want to make an attack, you'll be rolling a skill test tied to the type of weapon you're using and adding the combat attribute, just like any other skill test in the game. If you hit, which is rolling under your target number, you'll be primed to deal damage. But there's one hurdle that still remains: thresholds. Back to the front of the sheet, where you'll see both a peril and a damage threshold. These are determined by your willpower bonus and brawn bonus plus armor, respectively. Both enemies and survivors have them. In order for your attack to truly deal damage, you'll need to hit, roll your damage dice, and then the damage must exceed the base damage threshold in order to actually cut into the opponent. If it succeeds by more than 6, it will cut twice, more than 12, and it will cut 3 times, all the way to 4 times with 18. So if your damage threshold is, let's say, 7, the enemy will need to deal at least 8 points of damage in order to hurt you at all. And if they deal 8 plus 6, so 14 points of damage, they'll deal 2 cuts against you, and so on and so forth. For each cut of damage, you don't reduce a hit point pool. You don't have hit points. Rather, you move down the damage condition track, becoming lightly wounded, moderately, and so on down to dying. Certain abilities and tools in the game can bring you back up the damage track, but if you ever hit dying, it's time for a new conversation. Hitting dying means your character has a choice. Do they commit to death, surrendering their survivor to those that dwell beyond? Or do they claim mercy, dropping to unconsciousness for an hour and taking a mechanic-driven injury? Injuries are rolled on a table, and they have an effect that lasts usually for multiple days, but on some rolls could mean immediate death. Each time you take damage that pushes you into dying, or you take damage while you're already in dying, you must either take another injury or decide you die. Once you have reached 4 injuries, the next time you take damage, you will have a new choice: die, or take a permanent mechanic-driven scar. Here's what this means. Your character cannot die unless you will it. But every time you choose to resist, there will be a mechanical consequence for survivor. Moving up and down the damage tracker might be easy, and healing or recovering for certain injuries may just take time, but scars remain, and once you have a patchwork of them, you may determine your grizzled fighter is better served passing through the Well of Souls. This, however, does mean that you're never going to get shanked by some petty goblin in your first trip out the door and be forced to roll a new character after 20 minutes of play. That goblin shiv will just have left a jagged mark across your throat, but you can be alive. You have a scar. It's going to last. Something mechanical has still happened. You still have a consequence, but you don't have to end that character right then and there. The Peril tracker works identically to damage, but it's for assaults against your resolve and mind as opposed to your body. Peril is something that comes up all throughout the game and is kind of like your ability to mentally resist all the horrors and atrocities you're bound to encounter. As you move down the Peril track, you'll take a 5% or more hit to your chances of succeeding in skill tests. And if you drop to the bottom, you'll have a negative 20, and you'll suffer an affliction. Afflictions are similar in effects to injuries, but they affect your mind, whereas injuries affect your body. Here's the thing. Afflictions also stack with injuries when it comes to reaching the cap of 4. So if you have 2 injuries, and then you take on 2 afflictions, your next choice will be between death and a scar. For folks familiar with older editions, this is also a meaningful change. It used to be that the Peril track removed skill ranks, and the damage track had opportunities for you to take wounds at every juncture. While the concepts remain the same, the trackers have been overhauled with an eye towards streamlining and quickening the encounters, so all of the extremely detrimental stuff happens at the bottom end, and only on Peril are you adjusting things in the heat of the moment. One final note on fight scenes. Every weapon deals a single d6 worth of damage, plus an attribute modifier, which is at its surface feels like an oversimplification. The key thing to keep in mind, though, is that each weapon has a few qualities, and the combination of qualities are what makes them feel different. Sure, the base weapon damage might be the same, but there's a whole lot of things a weapon can do to be absolutely devastating on a battlefield, and dealing damage is just a fraction. In play, I found that the qualities actually make selecting your weapon a more important choice in Zweihander than it is in other games where certain weapons were obviously better because they deal more damage. Here, there's not that. There's not D8 weapons, D6 weapons, D10 weapons. They're all the same that way. You get different attribute bonuses, but it's really the qualities that make the difference. As an example, the Zweihander blade has the qualities of punishing and reach. Reach means that you can spend an action point to use an opportunity attack anytime anyone charges or runs into engaged distance with you. Punishing means that after you deal damage with the weapon, you can spend an action point to deal an additional d6 damage. Or take a look at the Cudgel, which still does a d6 plus a bonus, but it also has the powerful quality, which allows you to spend an action point after dealing damage to push your foe back 3 paces. So really it's a matter of, do you want to push your foe back? Do you want to deal a little bit extra damage? These are the types of choices that you're going to be making when you're selecting weapons, not just static damage. Okay, we could go on and on about different aspects of the game, but I think we'll stop there, as you should have had a good idea of the core concepts at this point. If you're a D&D fan, you're going to find that this game is just a bit more robust, but with a dark current running underneath, and with a wider range of character options available from the start. That said, you're going to find that the character options, I think, are going to feel a little bit more simple, and they aren't level 1 to 20. They are about, again, checking off all the boxes for that profession, and then moving on to another one. If you're familiar with previous editions, heck, maybe you even own a book or two, you're going to find Reforged Edition focused on streamlining the experience, as we've mentioned, as opposed to dramatically taking it in a new direction. Most everything you already know about the game can still carry over. It just may have a simpler mechanic on this end of things. That's it, folks. That's the video. If you're watching this within a few weeks of its release, the Kickstarter for Zweihander Reforged is currently live, and we'd love for you to go and back it. The book is completely written, and all the artwork is done, and we're hopeful to get this thing to press and out the door this year, 2024. As always, I'll drop a link below where you can pick up your own copy of Zweihander, and also you can check out a preview and build your own character if that's what you want to do right now for free. Daniel, thanks for hopping in and helping me with this one. I really appreciate it. If you like this video, consider subscribing to our channel. We have a lot of great content in different playlists, all centered around getting you into more RPGs and making those games better. And I'll say, we're getting back into making these how to play. So I've got one for Tales from the Loop and a bunch more games kind of in the queue, ready to go. I'm ready to record, and I'm excited to get back into it. We also have a podcast. It's called Geeks Can't, and it features myself and a couple of my Yahoo Game Master friends chatting about topics that came up at our game tables, Kickstarters, RPG news, and interviewing creators by the dozens. Go give us a listen if podcasts are your thing. It's also recorded live right here on YouTube, also on Twitch and Facebook every week. Oh, and we're also doing some live-streamed Zweihander games and chats here and on the Zweihander channel pretty regularly, so keep an eye out for that as well. You can expect a video like this about a different system every few months, with other RPG content interspersed between them. Until then, we'll see you next time.